Communion, the Vice President's important new book about Christianity. This summer, the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, released a new book entitled Communion, Finding My Way Back to Faith. Of course, Vance is no stranger to the world of publication, having already written Hillbilly Elegy, the 2016 memoir about his harrowing journey out of poverty and family brokenness. It is hard to imagine that Vance's second book will outsell his first one, but in the grand scheme of American national politics, this book is dramatically more important. Vance's second book functions like a spiritual memoir. It chronicles his upbringing in an environment of rural Protestantism, his exchange of that tradition in adulthood for atheism, and his eventual return to the Christian tradition. Vance's book is repeatedly explicit that he now embraces Roman Catholicism. Honestly, I'm discouraged by that. As a Baptist in the stream of the Protestant Reformation, I could wish that Vance's story was one of a full return to the Christianity of his youth. But the book tells his story, not mine. And in spite of my concerns about Roman Catholicism, there is much for Christians to celebrate in Vance's very important book. At the beginning of his book, Vance confronts the fact that, quote, an uncomfortable reality for any devout Christian is that so many people raised in the faith later fall away from it. This is true. For my entire ministry, I've dealt with the intense struggle of countless parents and grandparents, heartbroken over the departure of their children and grandchildren from the faith in which they sought to raise them. For the Vice President, this problem is autobiographical in his personal abandonment of the Christianity of his childhood to embrace atheism in adulthood. To be clear, Vance did not grow up in anything like a stable, consistent Christian environment, but he did encounter Christianity in several Pentecostal and Southern Baptist churches and through relationships with many who loved Jesus. Those experiences, however, were not enough to anchor Vance to the Christian tradition. Vance's move to atheism happened after his move away from home and the death of his beloved Mama. This combination of independence and pain is a combination that leads many away from the faith of their childhood. Vance says, quote, what paved my path to atheism wasn't books or ideas. It was sadness and a sense of betrayal. He later said, losing my faith wasn't consequently a primarily intellectual act. It was the equivalent of a divorce. There's a lesson in this for Christians concerned to address the problem Vance experienced. Our church communities must be clear that our faith is relevant to all of life. The world Vance confronted as an adult seemed disconnected from the biblical teaching he heard as a child. Vance said, quote, Christianity had become completely irrelevant to me. But when you read the Bible, you see that it is never disconnected from daily life. Scripture is always about the jobs, marriages, kids, friendships, enemies, pressures, and burdens we deal with every day. It is constantly raising to the surface our fears, longings, trusts, doubts, suspicions, loves, and inner conflicts that are always before us. When Christian parents, preachers, Sunday school leaders, and teachers obscure the relevance of Scripture for all of life, we do something God never does. We can never work too hard to share how every page of Scripture impacts every day of life. Our Christian communities also need to be sure we emphasize the biblical teaching on suffering. This can be particularly challenging because we don't want to bring up difficult topics that might make our children sad or uncomfortable. More than that, we can feel uncomfortable and unsure of how to address these topics. We need to get over it. Painful, heart-rending suffering will eventually enter the lives of our children. This cannot be stopped or avoided, but we can give them the resources to handle it. We can help them understand the origins of pain and the biblical teaching on sin. We can show them that a good and sovereign God is always working in the midst of pain to turn it for good for those who love God and are called according to His purpose. The Vice President of the United States got caught spiritually flat-footed when pain hit, and he didn't have biblical categories for it. This is a reminder for all Christians that as difficult as it can be to discuss painful subjects, we have a responsibility to prove that the Bible alone supplies sufficient answers to the pain our children are guaranteed to face in a sinful world. If ideas were not what led Vance away from Christianity, they were undoubtedly what brought him back to it. The Vice President's new book is a thoughtful work by a thoughtful man who clearly loves to read and engage ideas. He says, quote, what started my journey back to my faith was that Christianity bore the best fruit. It was the set of ideas and practices that generated the most good, the most truth, and the most beauty of anything I'd encountered. Vance makes clear that he was reading a lot of serious Christian authors, including Chesterton, Lewis, Aquinas, and Augustine, whom he credits as making the first crack in what he called his atheist armor. Vance makes clear that he was drawn to Catholicism for intellectual reasons, and that he loves its seriousness and intellectual rootedness. Here, the Vice President's new book serves as another reminder that just as we need to be showing the relevance of Scripture for all of life and its unique power to address pain in a fallen world, so we also need to demonstrate that a biblical and Christian worldview supplies the intellectual resources to think carefully and correctly about the issues we face in contemporary society. Psalm 119:43 calls the Bible the Word of Truth, and it is why it's the foundation of all profound and correct thought. The Vice President was attracted to the intellectual tradition of Roman Catholicism because those are the resources he found. But the intellectual resources of Protestantism are more than a match for anything produced by Rome. We've got Martin Luther on theology, Carl Henry on intellectual engagement, and Isaac Backus on political theology. We have Al Mohler on ethics and morality, John Dagg on church government. We have Schaeffer, Strong, Lewis, Spurgeon, Bunyan, and many, many more. Not all of these authors are for everyone, but Protestants in general and Baptists in particular are not in need of papal encyclicals to know how to think biblically. We have more than enough intellectual resources to bring God's truth to bear in the heady waters of contemporary intellectual engagement. Every one of our faith communities need to find ways to make this clear. Beyond the Vice President's rejection of atheism and embrace of the larger Christian tradition, one of the most encouraging elements of his new book is his clear rejection of worldly definitions of success in order to embrace family. Anyone who knows of Vance's success as an author, his wealth as a businessman, and his election to become the second highest-ranking elected official in the United States might say that he does not sound like someone who has rejected worldly standards of success. But that is just the point. Vance is honest in the book that he has attained all the external elements of validation it's possible to achieve, and after he got them, found them wanting. Once he started meeting all the individuals in the elite culture he climbed into, he thought he would discover they were more sophisticated than the people he grew up with in small towns in the South and Midwest. Instead, he says he discovered those same elites were, quote, as screwed up as anyone. What Vance calls the meritocracy, he candidly admits, did not work in leading to happiness. Vance's book is filled with expressions of devotion to his wife, love for his kids, his prayers to be a good husband and father, his desires to see his children's character formed in traditional institutions like the church. He even relates candid stories of being distracted as vice president with messages on his cell phone when he was supposed to be playing with his kids. Most people alive would give the Vice President of the United States a pass for texting on his phone on a Saturday morning. Not Vance. He called such distractions a failure of character. I think most working dads could use a role model like J.D. Vance, who, after capturing everything the world has to offer, achieved the perspective that none of those things is more important than being a dad who pays attention to his kids and wrestles with them on the floor. For every dad willing to learn from Vance, there's a lesson here that will save you, your kids, and your wife years of frustration and heartache. As I mentioned, I don't agree with everything in the Vice President's book. You won't either. But that doesn't mean the book is not a good and important one. In this book, Vance interacts with Bible verses like Psalm 73, Matthew 7:16-20, 1 Corinthians 15:32, and Philippians 4:8, to name just a few. He makes intellectual arguments against atheism and for Christianity. He interacts with everything from papal encyclicals to the works of C.S. Lewis. He calls himself a Christian statesman and opens the introduction of the book with a reference to what he describes as, quote, the core of the Christian faith, that Jesus Christ is the only begotten Son of God, was born of the Virgin Mary, was crucified for our sin, and rose from the dead. To have all of this and much more written by the sitting Vice President of the United States of America is not only unprecedented, but very, very encouraging. It's encouraging for Christians like me who desire to see Christian witness fill up more and more of our public dialogue. It's also encouraging to any Christian discouraged by someone they love who's drifted away from the truth and away from the faith. Vance's book is honest that he, like many, drifted away from the faith of his childhood. His book is also encouraging that he found his way back. His book reminds that we're all on a journey of faith regardless of where we started or where we are right now. He gets at this idea with the encouraging words, quote, "If you believe Jesus is the Son of God and rose from the dead on the third day, you're on the right track." Vance's book is an encouragement that you can get off this track and find your way back on it. It's a reminder that once all of us are on the track, we need to keep moving. I'm thankful for the long distance the Vice President has traveled down this track, and am praying for him to keep moving down it. Since none of us have yet arrived on God's destination for us on the journey of faith in Jesus, I'm praying for the rest of us too.